You know, I remember trying to figure out why I couldn't just easily buy my favorite British Columbia wine here in Ontario,
Right.
or why my friend, she's a nurse, had such a nightmare getting her credentials recognized when she moved provinces.
Yeah, that happens all the time.
It just seems absurd, doesn't it? So today, we're doing a deep dive into something pretty surprising, really,
Which is,
which is that Canada, this huge country, often finds it easier for its businesses to trade with other countries than with other provinces.
it's a fascinating paradox, absolutely. And that's what we're going to unpack today.
Okay.
Our mission for this deep dive is really to pull out the most important nuggets of knowledge from the sources you've shared on these interprovincial trade barriers.
Right.
Yeah. What are they exactly? Why are they stuck around for so long? And what's the actual impact on the economy, sure, but also on, your daily life?
So we're aiming for that shortcut, that clear, engaging way to get you up to speed on this.
Exactly, to help you really understand what's going on.
Okay, let's unpack this then, because honestly, it feels incredibly counterintuitive.
It does.
How can trade possibly be harder within Canada than, say, shipping goods to the US or even Europe?
Well, what's really fascinating here and important to grasp is that we're not talking about traditional tariffs.
Not like duties at the border.
No, exactly. Instead, it's this whole web of diffuse non-tariff barriers.
Okay.
And these usually pop up because provinces have different laws,
Mhm.
different regulations, standards, certifications, all that stuff.
So it's like a tangle of red tape.
Pretty much. Think of it like that, yeah. A tangle that just gets thicker the moment you try to cross a provincial line with your goods or services.
Okay, so not obvious taxes, but things that still manage to gum up the works for businesses.
Definitely.
Can you give us some specific examples, like real-world stuff, that makes this friction clear?
Absolutely. Let's start with transportation. That's
Okay.
fundamental, right? Moving things around. So commercial truck drivers might need multiple inspections, sometimes duplicative ones, when they cross borders.
Seriously, different inspections for the same truck.
Sometimes, yeah. Or they might even have to change the signage on their vehicle at each border crossing.
Oh, come on.
And then you've got different maximum weight limits for trucks or different safety rules.
So a truck could be perfectly legal in Alberta, but then...
But then drive a few kilometers into BC or Saskatchewan, and suddenly it's non-compliant.
Wow. That sounds like a constant bureaucratic maze just for the truckers.
It's a huge logistical headache, yeah.
Okay, beyond transport, what about the actual products, the goods moving across these internal borders?
Right.
Are, like, Ontario peaches harder to sell in Quebec than maybe in Michigan?
Well, for goods, we often see different rules for packaging and labeling. Think about fruit and vegetable producers.
Mm-hmm.
They might face varying regulations across provinces, which adds costs, adds complexity.
More red tape?
Exactly. And then you mentioned wine earlier. There's the really persistent and, let's be honest, kind of ridiculous issue of provincial liquor monopolies.
Ah, yes, the wine problem.
It can literally, and I mean literally, be easier to buy California wine in Ontario than wine from BC.
That's wild.
Because these rules limit direct buying between provinces. Though, it's worth pointing out, Alberta is generally seen as having the most open liquor market in Canada.
Okay, good for Alberta.
And we also have supply management, for dairy and poultry. That controls supply, affects prices, and acts as another kind of barrier.
So if you're a farmer or a small vineyard owner, your own country can actually be your biggest hurdle sometimes.
It can feel that way, for sure.
What about people, like professionals?
Mm.
Doctors, nurses, engineers who want to move and work somewhere else in Canada?
That's a huge one. And it directly affects, your ability to access skilled services or for professionals to find work easily.
How so?
Get this. There are over 600 professional credentialing bodies across Canada. Yep. And they often impose different certification requirements.
So my friend the nurse.
Exactly.
Hmm?
A nurse trained in Ontario might need extra training or exams to work in Alberta, even if their skills are totally equivalent. A doctor licensed in one province can't just hang up a shingle in another.
That seems incredibly wasteful.
It can be. It restricts mobility and, makes it harder to match skills with needs across the country.
So, okay, we zoom out from these individual frustrations, the trucking, the wine, the nurses. What's the bigger picture, the overall impact on Canada's economy?
Well, in practice, it means it can genuinely be more efficient, maybe cheaper, for a Canadian company in, say, Ontario, to trade with a partner in a country we have a free trade deal with.
Like the US or Europe?
Right. Than it is for them to trade with a company in Quebec or British Columbia.
That just sounds wrong.
It's a powerful statement, isn't it? It really shows how significant these non-tariff barriers have become.
So what does this all mean then? I mean, why are these barriers even there? Some of them, like you said, the liquor boards, they sound like they've been around practically since Confederation.
It really raises that important question, doesn't it? Why do they persist?
Yeah.
Historically, well, many of them started as maybe arguably archaic attempts by provinces to protect local jobs or industries.
Like the liquor boards or those farm marketing agencies.
Exactly. They were set up, they became entrenched, and provinces are often quite protective of those local industries.
And protective on the revenue, too, I bet.
And let's be honest, protective of these significant revenues they collect from some of these regulated sectors? Absolutely. There's a reluctance to give up that autonomy or that cash flow.
But hang on, didn't the Constitution, like the foundation of Canada, intend for free trade between provinces? I feel like I learned that in school. Section something?
You're absolutely right to bring that up. Section 121 of the Constitution Act, 1867.
Right, Section 121.
It says, and I'm paraphrasing slightly, that all goods produced in one province shall be admitted free into the others.
Sounds pretty clear. Admitted free.
It sounds clear, yes. But the courts have interpreted this very, very narrowly over the years.
How so?
Well, way back in 1921, there was the Gold Seal case. It essentially ruled that Section 121 only prevents provinces from setting up actual customs posts or charging duties on goods from other provinces.
Okay, so no tariffs.
Right. But it didn't stop provinces from putting up all sorts of other barriers, regulations, standards, licensing rules.
So it opened the door for all these non-tariff barriers we're talking about.
Precisely. And more recently, the Como case in 2018, you might remember that one. It was about a guy bringing beer across the New Brunswick-Quebec border.
Oh, yeah, the beer case.
That case, unfortunately, kind of cemented this narrow view. The Supreme Court basically said provinces can enact laws that might impact trade, as long as the main purpose isn't protectionism.
So they can put up walls as long as they say it's for, I don't know, health or safety, even if it blocks trade.
That's essentially the outcome, yes. Even if it has a protectionist effect, if the primary intent claimed is something else within provincial jurisdiction, it's generally allowed.
That seems like a pretty big loophole.
It is. And adding another layer of complexity is something lawyers call the double aspect doctrine.
Okay, what's that? Sounds complicated.
It kind of is. But think of it like this. Sometimes both the federal government and the provincial governments can have legitimate legal authority over the same subject area.
Like overlapping jurisdictions.
Exactly. So Ottawa might pass a law related to, say, national trade standards, but a province might have its own law touching the same product, claiming it's about local consumer protection or environmental standards.
And both laws could be valid.
Both can be legally valid, yeah. Which can lead to friction, confusion, and ultimately create these overlapping rules that act as barriers to smooth trade.
Okay, so legal interpretations, historical reasons. What about the politics today? You mentioned provinces protecting revenue, but are there other political costs? Like, why don't premiers just agree to tear down the walls if it helps the national economy?
It's definitely not just about the money, though. That's part of it. There are real political calculations.
Like what?
Well, former Quebec Premier Philippe Couillard once pointed out the huge political cost of, say, changing Quebec's language laws.
How does that connect?
He argued that weakening them, even slightly, to make the province maybe more accessible for outside businesses or workers would likely cause significant turmoil politically within Quebec.
Ah, okay. So protecting cultural elements can act like a trade barrier, too, even if that's not the main intent.
It can have that effect, and this applies more broadly, too. It's just really hard for politicians to sell the benefits of liberalization.
Why is that?
Because the benefits may be slightly lower prices for everyone, a bit more choice, some overall GDP growth, they're spread out, they're diffuse, maybe not immediately noticeable to the average person.
Right, abstract gain.
Exactly. But the potential costs, like potential job losses in a specific local industry that was protected.
Those are very concentrated, very visible.
Highly visible, yeah.
Yeah.
And the people affected will likely make a lot more noise than the people benefiting slightly. So politicians often focus on avoiding those concentrated losses, even if it means sacrificing those broader, more abstract gains.
Okay, so we've got the history, the legal stuff, the politics. But let's talk numbers. We hear these barriers cost Canada a lot. How much are we actually talking about? This is where it gets really interesting, right?
It really is. And the consensus from, well, quite a few studies, is that these barriers act like a significant drag on our economy.
Drag how big?
Okay, so a Statistics Canada study back in 2020 tried to put a number on it. They estimated the burden of these internal barriers was equivalent to imposing a 6.9% tariff on goods and services traded between provinces.
Wow, nearly 7%. That's like having internal customs duties.
Effectively, yeah. And other reports, looking at the potential gains from removing these barriers, suggest free interprovincial trade could boost Canada's economy by over $200 billion a year.
200 billion.
That's a common figure cited, yeah. Some estimates even go as high as $245 billion annually.
That's massive. What does that mean per person?
Well, translate that down, and could mean something like an extra $2,300 to $4,000 per Canadian per year.
Whoa.
Or maybe $7,500 per household.
Mm.
Plus, potentially lower prices on goods and services, maybe up to 15% lower according to some models.
Those numbers are just staggering. $200 billion. And to put that in perspective, that's more than, Canada's entire annual defense budget.
Sure.
It's like creating a whole new major industry every single year.
It gives you a sense of the scale. Yeah, it's not just some abstract economic number. It's a measure of, you could say, unrealized potential, a constant drag on our overall prosperity and competitiveness.
But hang on, if the benefits are that huge, that clear, why hasn't this just been fixed already? There must be another side to this story, right? A counter-argument.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it's really crucial to acknowledge this different perspective. There's definitely debate around those big numbers.
Who's so pushing back?
The Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, the CCPA, for instance, they've argued pretty strongly that these huge numbers, like the $200 billion figure, are highly implausible and vastly overstated.
Okay. Why do they say that? What's their reasoning?
Well, they argue that the actual existing trade barriers are, in their view, very small.
Small how?
They tend to point primarily to things like provincial alcohol monopolies, some relatively minor trucking regulations that are still inconsistent, and maybe some government procurement policies that favor local suppliers.
So they're saying the list of real barriers is much shorter than people think.
That's part of their argument, yes. And they also push back on the idea that interprovincial trade is somehow broken. They'll point out that it's actually been growing quite steadily.
Growing?
Yeah, they noted, I think, a 34% growth between 2007 and maybe around 2020 or so, which they say is pretty comparable to Canada's growth in international exports over the same period. So their take is things are doing just fine.
Okay, that's a significant counterpoint. So it's not just quibbling over the exact dollar amount, is it? It sounds more like a fundamental disagreement about how big the problem actually is.
It is. And it goes deeper than just the numbers.
How so? If they think the numbers are implausible, how do the economists supporting the $200 billion figure defend their models?
Well, the CCPA criticizes the methodology behind those big estimates.
Ah, the assumptions they use.
Exactly. They suggest these models rely on unrealistic assumptions. For example, maybe not fully accounting for the real differences in provincial economies.
Yeah.
Different industrial structures, different resources.
Right, you can't just assume everything would magically become uniform.
Or they argue that the models sometimes inappropriately apply economic concepts designed for international trade barriers, like tariffs, to the much more complex world of interprovincial non-tariff barriers.
Okay, so it's a methodological debate, too.
It is. And beyond the numbers, there's that philosophical debate you hinted at. The CCPA views the big push for something called mutual recognition.
What's that again?
Mutual recognition is basically the idea that if a product or a professional's credentials meet the standards in one province, they should automatically be accepted in all other provinces.
Sounds sensible on the surface.
It does. But the CCPA and others see this push as potentially a Trojan horse for deregulation.
A Trojan horse?
Meaning they worry it's not just about efficiency, but it's really a way to weaken regulations across the board. They raise concerns about a potential race to the bottom.
Race to the bottom?
Yeah, the fear that provinces might lower their standards for, say, environmental protection or worker safety or consumer protection just to become the easiest province to get certified or sell goods in.
Ah, okay. So the concern is that harmonizing standards could mean harmonizing down to the lowest common denominator, potentially sacrificing important protections.
That's the core of the concern, yes. So you see, it's not just an economic efficiency argument. It's also tangled up in values, provincial autonomy versus national standards, the role of regulation itself.
Okay, so we have these costs, these complexities, this debate even over how big the economic impact is. Given all that, is anything actually being done? Is there any real momentum to tackle these barriers, or are these walls pretty much here to stay?
No, there's definitely momentum, actually quite significant momentum recently.
Really? What's driving that?
A big part of it, interestingly, seems to be external pressure, particularly the threat or the reality of U.S. protectionism and tariffs in recent years.
Ah, so trouble with trade abroad makes us look inward.
Exactly. It seems to have really elevated the urgency around fixing our own internal market. It's prompted this focus on the idea that, Canada first should also mean free trade between provinces.
Makes sense. So what has actually happened? Any concrete actions?
Yes, quite a bit, especially at the federal level recently.
Okay.
First off, the federal government seems to be trying to get its own house in order. Prime Minister Trudeau hosted a big Canada-U.S. economic summit back on February 7th, 2025, and internal trade barriers were a major theme.
Right.
The internal trade minister, Anita Anand, even suggested some barriers could be tackled within a month, which sounded ambitious.
Very ambitious. Did anything come of that?
Well, perhaps not that fast, but there was a pretty major announcement. As of June 30th, 2025, the finance minister, Chrystia Freeland, announced that the federal government was removing all 53 of its own exemptions listed in the Canadian Free Trade Agreement.
All 53 federal exemptions. What does that mean?
It means the federal government looked at the National Trade Deal, the CFTA, found where its own rules or policies were creating barriers between provinces, and basically said, we're getting rid of these.
Okay, so Ottawa is leading by example, removing its own roadblocks first.
That seems to be the strategy. Plus, there was Bill C-5, which passed around the same time, June 26th. That bill also aims to reduce some federal restrictions and, importantly, speed up the permitting process for big infrastructure projects, which can also help trade flow.
Okay, so the feds are definitely moving. That's a big shift. What prompted that level of commitment now, do you think, beyond the U.S. pressure?
It seems like a combination of that external pressure, the ongoing economic arguments finally hitting home, and perhaps a recognition that, in a more uncertain global environment, strengthening our internal market is just smart economics and politics.
Makes sense. So the feds are cleaning their house. What about the provinces? Are they getting on board too? Or are they still digging in their heels?
No, there's been really remarkable progress on the provincial front as well, especially coming out of a key meeting.
Which meeting was that?
A First Ministers meeting back on March 5th, 2025. The premiers and the prime minister got together, and they made some significant commitments.
Like,
They agreed to rapidly review the remaining exceptions provinces have listed in that Canadian Free Trade Agreement.
so tackling the provincial exemptions now too.
Right. And to swiftly negotiate adding the financial services sector into the CFTA, that's been a gap.
Okay. Anything else?
Yes. Two other big ones. They agreed to immediately launch negotiations for mutual recognition. There's that term again for all consumer goods, so food, aiming for an action plan by March 31st, 2025.
Mutual recognition for consumer goods. So if it's safe to sell in one province, it's safe to sell everywhere, except food.
That's the goal they're negotiating towards. And crucially, they also committed to prioritizing labor mobility.
Helping professionals move and work.
Exactly. Adopting a service standard of 30 days or less to process applications for certified workers moving between provinces.
Yeah.
Trying to speed up that credential recognition we talked about earlier.
30 days is better than waiting months, I guess.
It's a start, yeah.
Yeah.
A concrete target.
Okay. And now, the question everyone always asks when this topic comes up. What about booze? Any movement on buying wine or beer across provincial lines?
Yes, the perennial favorite. And actually, yes, there was movement there too.
Good news.
Looks like it. At that same March meeting, a bunch of governments, BC, Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Ontario, Quebec, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, plus the feds committed to advancing pan-Canadian direct-to-consumer alcohol sales, specifically for Canadian products.
Direct to consumer. So I could order that BC wine online and get it shipped here to Ontario.
That's the direction they committed to move towards for Canadian-made alcohol.
Oh.
It's worth noting Manitoba already allows this for all booze, and BC allows it for wine. So expanding that model.
Okay, that would be a popular change for many people.
I suspect so.
So those are big agreements at the First Minister's level. Are individual provinces also taking steps on their own? Or are they waiting for these national deals?
No, some provinces are definitely pushing ahead individually or in regional groups.
Who's leading the charge?
Well, Ontario, under Premier Doug Ford, has been quite vocal and has passed legislation aimed at eliminating internal barriers. They've also signed specific agreements to reduce barriers with several provinces, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, Alberta just recently on June 1st, 2025, and PEI and Saskatchewan on June 2nd.
So lots of bilateral deals happening too.
Seems like it. And Alberta continues to be a real leader here.
We mentioned their open liquor market. What else?
Their Labor Mobility Act from 2023 is really focused on streamlining that credential recognition. Get this. Their regulatory bodies are now taking an average of only 6 days to make decisions for out-of-province professionals.
6 days, down from potentially months.
Yeah. And their College of Physicians and Surgeons is even faster average decision time, 0.2 days. Basically immediate for doctors who qualify.
Wow. Okay, Alberta's not messing around.
No. And an analysis by the Montreal Economic Institute actually found Alberta has the fewest overall trade barriers among the provinces.
Interesting. And it sounds like the Western provinces generally have been more proactive, maybe working together.
They certainly have. There's the new West Partnership Trade Agreement. That's BC, Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba.
Right, the NWPTA.
It's often highlighted as a really successful model. They've worked hard to streamline regulations, improve labor mobility amongst themselves.
And has it worked? Has it made a difference?
Apparently, yes. Studies have shown it's actually raised plant productivity within that Western bloc by almost 2%.
2%. That's a real measurable impact just from regional cooperation.
It is. It shows what can be achieved when there's that shared political will, at least regionally.
Okay, that honestly sounds like a lot of concrete progress recently. Federal action, First Minister's commitments, provincial initiatives, regional partnerships.
There has been, yes.
But if it's so clear these barriers are costly and there's all this momentum you're describing, why haven't they all just been swept away, like overnight? What are the roadblocks still standing? Why isn't this just a flip the switch moment?
Yeah, that's the crucial question, isn't it? Why is change still gradual, not instantaneous? And despite all the federal efforts and these agreements, many significant provincial barriers do remain.
Such as?
Well, the big ones often mentioned are things like the supply management system for dairy and poultry.
Yeah.
That's deeply entrenched, involves federal-provincial coordination, and affects powerful lobby groups.
Okay, supply management. What else?
Quebec's language requirements, as we discussed, can still act as a barrier in practice for some businesses and professionals. And just generally, there are still hundreds, maybe thousands, of specific provincial regulations and standards that haven't been harmonized yet.
So it's not just a matter of political will then. There are practical hurdles too, like just identifying all these barriers.
That's a huge part of it, actually. It's
Yeah.
more complex than you might think. For one thing, there isn't even a single comprehensive agreed-upon list of all existing internal trade barriers across Canada.
We don't even have a full inventory.
Not one that everyone agrees on. And even getting consensus on what constitutes a barrier can be tricky. We'll take that 30-day standard for processing credentials we mentioned. Is that still a barrier if another province like Alberta manages to do it in 6 days or less than a day?
Good point. Where do you draw the line?
Exactly. There's a whole range of interpretations about what's an acceptable difference versus an actual impediment to trade or mobility.
Okay. And what about that idea of mutual recognition? Is that still facing hurdles?
It is. While leaders committed to negotiate it for consumer goods, the concept itself is still debated. Those concerns we talked about earlier about potentially causing a race to the bottom on standard.
Right, the deregulation fear.
Those concerns haven't gone away. Finding a balance between facilitating trade and maintaining robust standards for things like safety, environmental protection, consumer rights, that's a real challenge.
And the political will. You said there's momentum, but is it still a challenge at the provincial level, even with all this recent movement?
I think it remains a challenge, yes. Because ultimately, individual provinces still need to balance these potential national economic gains against protecting their own entrenched local interests or specific revenue sources they rely on.
That prisoner's dilemma you mentioned earlier.
Exactly. It's still a play. Each province might think, we'd all be better off if everyone opened up.
Yeah.
But am I willing to go first?
Mm-hmm.
What if I lower my barriers, lose some local jobs or revenue, and the other provinces don't follow suit? That fear of being taken advantage of can lead to inaction, even if everyone knows the status quo hurts the collective.
So that fear holds things back.
It can. And One other point from a Statistics Canada survey is worth remembering. When they actually asked businesses what their biggest obstacles to interprovincial trade
What
were,
did they say? Was it regulations?
regulations were on the list, but the top reported obstacles were actually transportation cost and availability.
Hmm.
Over 40% cited that.
Just the basic cost and logistics of moving things across a vast country.
Right. And many businesses also just said, their business is inherently local, or they simply had no interest in trading with other provinces.
So sometimes it's not even a barrier per se, it's just
Yeah.
business reality or market forces.
Exactly. It's important to keep that perspective, too. It's not always about red tape. Sometimes it's just distance, cost, or lack of market demand.
Okay, so given these persistent roadblocks, the politics, the practicalities, the definitional issues, what are some of the ideas being floated for the future? How do we really break through these remaining walls?
Well, there are some pretty interesting, maybe even radical, solutions being proposed.
Like what?
The Macdonald-Laurier Institute, a think tank, has suggested much stronger federal leadership might be needed. Maybe even through something like a national charter of economic rights that could potentially compel provinces to act.
A charter of economic rights? That sounds quite forceful.
It would be, yeah. Another really unique idea came from Scotiabank.
The bank.
Yeah. They proposed a way to overcome that prisoner's dilemma we keep talking about. Their idea is for the federal government to offer financial incentives, basically, cash payments to provinces to encourage them to lower barriers.
Okay, paying provinces to cooperate.
But here's the twist.
Yeah.
Pay them up front and finance those payments based on the future economic gains expected from liberalization.
Whoa, so give them the money now based on projected future growth.
Exactly. They estimated maybe $15 billion annually could be generated in extra growth. So the feds could borrow against that future revenue to pay the provinces now, removing their short-term financial risk of acting alone.
That's a really creative financial solution to a political problem.
It is. Quite outside the box. And another interesting idea leverages technology.
AI.
Potentially, yeah. Using artificial intelligence to systematically compare thousands of provincial regulations side by side.
To find the differences automatically.
Precisely. To identify exactly where the rules diverge, which could make it much easier and faster to pinpoint what actually needs to be harmonized or where mutual recognition could apply. Take some of the manual slog out of it.
So using tech to cut through the complexity.
That's the idea.
Okay. So we've really covered a lot of ground here. We've explored this surprising problem of Canada's internal trade barriers.
Yeah.
Looked at the complex history, the politics that created them, the, massive economic stakes involved, and also the very real recent breakthroughs that seem to be pointing towards a more integrated future.
It really feels like a journey, doesn't it? From that sort of historical protectionism towards a future that maybe, with this renewed political will and some of these innovative solutions, could actually see a more unified economic nation.
Right.
And if you connect this to the bigger picture, the real question is, can Canada truly function as a single, unified economic market?
Or will it continue to operate more like a collection of, somewhat separate economic regions despite sharing a flag and a border?
Exactly. It kind of challenges our whole notion of what it means to be one country economically.
So here's something to think about as we wrap up. You might wonder, given all this talk about GDP gains and efficiencies, what about the things we can't easily measure? What unforeseen innovations, maybe entirely new industries, could possibly emerge if Canada truly unlocks its full internal economic potential beyond just the billions added to GDP?
That's a great question.
What surprising ripple effects might we see across society if goods, services, and especially people could move with truly minimal friction across all our provincial and territorial borders? What stands out to you from this deep dive?